the view is what's displayed to the screen, and the model is basically, oh, sorry. The model is basically the brains of the app. So in our app that we built last week, for example, the model is just like the information that we display to the screen. So, okay, in terms of how these different aspects of the MVC model work, first of all, the model and the view cannot talk. There's no communication between the model and view. They're entirely separate things. The way that your app works and the way that the app is displayed are two things entirely separate, and they're controlled by the controller. So the controller basically owns the model and it owns the view. And it has this one-way communication, which I drew with red arrows. I'm going to pull up last week's demo, which should be somewhere, but Elvis moved. Okay, here it is. So this is the app that Elvis built last week. We can see, again, we're in the view controller. The only thing you guys should have really touched is the view controller. And this view controller, with its one-directional red arrow, owns a view, right? In this UI view did load, you can see this view that we've used everywhere, like view add subview. Can everyone see this text, by the way? Is this big enough? Okay. This view.add subview, that's the view. That's that little view bubble. All of this stuff here, these UI image views, UI labels, those are all also part of the view as they get added to the view. Those are separate things. The model, though, because this is a small app, there isn't really a big model. We're just displaying data. So there's not much to demo. The model is literally like this small section of code. The small like bit of data that our app controls. As we get into bigger apps that have more complicated ways of working, that'll be entire other files. But at this moment, it's just that little, not even a full line of code. And I guess like this too. So this one directional arrow, which is ownership, works because, again, these views live inside of this view controller. That's the ownership arrow. Cool. So then how do views talk to controllers? And why is this necessary? For one, let's take the UI button as an example. When you click on a button on your screen, the way it works is the button knows that it's being clicked on, but the controller doesn't. The button is like, hey, somebody touched me, and then it needs a way to pass that information to the controller so the controller can handle it with the model and do whatever it needs to do to update the state of your app. And so the way that that system works, for example, is with targets. This is one way of you communicating to a controller. We put a target on the controller and say, we link it to that button and say, whenever that button gets pressed, we're going to basically shoot an arrow at the target. And this is also what we've seen last week, right? We have this button here where we add the target. That's this line of code here. We add a target to the button, and this target is a function. So this function here, the what happens when our button is pressed, that's our target. And then our button says, this is our target. So every time you tap the button, it shoots an arrow at this function, and this function runs inside the controller as opposed to inside the button. That's one way of communicating. As you get into more complicated apps, again, you're going to need more complicated ways of communicating. As you noticed, this button function is a single function. What if this like view-to-view controller communication needs multiple functions? An example of this would be with like a text view, for example, or a slider. So you might want to know with a slider, like the person started sliding. The person has moved their slider to this location. The person stopped sliding. All of those functions are different functions. And the way we implement that is with what's called protocols. In our view, we define a protocol, which is the list of functions. It's literally, it doesn't even have what the functions do. It just has a list of like, I want this function to exist. I want that function to exist. And with our slider example, those could be things like they started sliding, or the slider move to this location. Could be whatever list of functions you want. And then our controller takes that list of functions and it provides an implementation for them. So the controller says, I want to be able to have this view communicate with me. So it has the implementations for those functions. And then the same system with the targets happens, where anytime those functions need to be called, we shoot an arrow at those functions and they get called. Cool. Now, again, what if we want our model to talk to the controller? On top of your model just being the brains of how it works, your model is also what's responsible for connecting to the web, right? So if I wanted to pull all the data from CourseGrad, for example, that would be the model's job. And then you have to display that through a controller to the view. So let's say I send a request to CourseGrad's database and I say, I want that data. How does the model communicate to the controller? The way that we do it is actually very similar to targets, but we call them closures. And this is what we're going to spend most of the time in this class talking about, in this course talking about. Very similar thing. We define a closure, and then every time we need it, we shoot an arrow at it, and it calls a function. Another way that we might or might not get into, depending on how much time we have at the end of the semester, is what's called notification center, which is basically the model has this little radio system. And anytime it wants to, anytime it receives data or whatever, it sends this radio message across your entire app. And whichever controller you want can listen into that radio station and call its own function. This is what's called notifications. And it's different than like push notifications. It's a notification center in your actual like Xcode system. Cool. So that's the way that a single page works between controllers, views, and models. Does anyone have any questions on that at the start? Cool. So now we're going to get into multi-paged apps. What if I wanted to extend this and say, we have our one view. What if when I click a button, it brings us to another view? So a good example of this is like your contacts page or settings page, right? With the settings, you click on a setting and it brings you to another page. There's two ways of doing this. The first of which is present view controller. I actually can't think of an app that uses this off the top of my head, but you might have seen it. Basically, you click on a button and out of nowhere, just another view rises. These two things are considered two different pages, right? And in such, they have their two separate view controllers. But the way we implement that is that the view controller that rises is considered the view of the other MVC's system. Now I have an image, it'll make it more clear. If this part at the top is the MVC of this back white screen, and this MVC down here is the MVC of our blue page, when we press that button, what happens is this MVC basically gets put as the view of our original view controller. And you can kind of see with this navigation system, the old view controller still exists, right? In this picture, it's still in the background. It still exists. But we now just have this other view controller, this entire view controller on top of it. And this is actually a debate me and Reed were having recently, but it's you can use this system with view controllers as small views as well inside of your screen. Whether that's a good idea or not is still up for debates, but you can think of these view controllers as any system that controls a view. But again, in this course, we're only going to be thinking of them as entire paged apps. And the code for that looks like this. It's 3 very simple lines. So if I have this line, my view controller, this represents this view controller here. My view controller is this blue screen, the one that's gonna pop up. Inside my original controller, whenever I want it to pop up, whatever happens, let's say inside the target of my button function, I just say present view controller. This animated flag means that it will rise up from the bottom. And completion, we're just going to set nil for now. Then let's say we do a whole bunch of stuff in here. When we want to get that to disappear, we call this dismiss function. So this dismiss line of code, so these two lines of code are in your original view controller, and this last line of code is going to be in your presented view controller whenever you want it to disappear. Cool. Does anyone have any questions on presenting? Nice. Then we'll move on. This is kind of the more important way of navigation, the one that you'll see most frequently, which is called push view controller. I think it's called push view controller because it looks like the screen is like pushing in from the right side. And a good example of this is with the settings page, right? If I click on a button, an entirely new like sub settings page pops up and pushes that one off the screen. This is implemented with similarly an MVC system, but your main MVC is what's called a UI navigation controller. This is, again, another MVC, but it doesn't actually have its own view. The navigation controller, the purple circle, controls the system of navigation, and its view, it relies on view controllers to have a view. So with a navigation controller, you need to have a view there, or else it won't be displaying anything. And let's say when you want to push a new view controller onto this navigation system, it's implemented in a stack. So if I push the view controller, another view controller will pop up, and all the control is given to that view controller. And again, like a stack, you can think of like a stack of plates. Yes. Yes, this original settings page is this UI view controller. All of this MVC stuff is kind of abstracted away in a UI navigation controller. It has its own code, like there is a UI navigation controller. We're not gonna actually be writing our own UI navigation controllers. So the extent of that will just be like UI navigation controller. We wrap a UI view controller and then let it all handle that from there. But yes. So as I was saying, it's implemented as a stack. So I can push a new view. That would be like moving to the next settings page. And because it's a stack, I can push as many views as I want. Unlike present, if I click present like a button, it pops up. I can't present on top of that because that's a popped up view. With this, I can present as many as I want. And that's why in settings, you can like continue down the chain for however long there is. And it actually comes with its own back button. You'll see in the settings page, we have a back button there. That's already implemented for you in this navigation controller up there. Yes.
In both of these view controllers, they share the same model, right? Behind
You mean like both of these or
push and present views, the previous one?
they can, but not necessarily. So the way that models are shared is models are a lot more loosely shared than views, right? With this, we have a very strict and rigorous way of saying view controller, MVCs go as views. With models, any controller can pretty much access any model it wants. But again, no view can, right? There's a wall between views and models. So depending on how you want to design your app, you can have it just be one entire model and all the controllers access it, or you can have it split up where things pass through. But I think most of the apps we're building in this course will have a single model, and that's useful for navigation, right? If we go back to the course grab example, if I pull from course grab, I want that all of that data that I pulled from course grab, I want that to be in one place, and all the controllers throughout my app can access it, kind of thing. So yeah. And then just like we've stacked on top, we can unstack and pop them off. Every time we unstack, by the way, these view controllers disappear. They get erased from memory. So this is another like small thing that you want to consider when designing apps, which is that if you have data that you want to be stored. That's why we use models, and that's why we have shared models. We don't want a model to solely exist in this view controller if we want to use that model elsewhere in other views. So we pop the view controller, it disappears from memory, gets deleted, never to be seen again, and then we go back. So a question might be, how do you communicate between these different, wait, what? Oh, yes. Before we get into communication, we have the 3 lines of code that are needed for this. We have your view controller that you want to push. So in this case, this would be the next one that comes up here. Then inside this view controller, we say view controller push your new view controller, or navigation controller dot push view controller. You might notice a special question mark here. Somebody want to tell me what this question mark means? Yes. Yeah. The question mark represents an optional, right? So if you're thinking about this from this whole like communication standpoint, this UI view controller, it doesn't know if a navigation controller exists, right? This view controller, which is acting as a view, is not allowed to talk to the controller, right? It's a one-way arrow. So this navigation controller might or might not exist, and if it does, then we can push. If it doesn't, then we can't. Yeah. You'll notice here, I just use navigation controller question mark dot push, right? We taught you in week 1 to say things like if let or guard let. That's something you can do. This is another add-on to that, which is way less common, except in basically this case, which is you just have the question mark and then the dot. And this basically means that if it's nil, it'll just do nothing, right? This line of code just disappears if navigation controller is nil. So as you're working on projects, if you notice that every time you call push view controller, a view controller doesn't actually get pushed to the screen, I would say to look into the fact that your navigation controller actually exists. To look into the fact that these view controllers have navigation controllers that wrap them. And then similarly, this view controller can pop the last view controller. So with our 2 view controllers, unlike presenting, where one view controller presents its sub-view controller, and then this view controller is responsible for saying when it wants to disappear. Now this view controller pushes our new view controller, and this view controller also tells this view controller when to leave. So all 3 of these lines will appear in that one view controller. But how do you know when we want the last view controller to leave, right? Like what if I'm on a new screen, the screen that isn't on the view controller that isn't displayed on screen, and the view controller that like isn't running? How does that know when to leave based on the stuff that's happening currently on your screen? And for that, we need more communication between different view controllers. So how do we have this inter-view controller communication? It's with protocols. It's the same thing as views communicating to UI view controllers. Now it's just UI view controllers communicating to other UI view controllers. So again, in our new view controller, we can make a protocol, a menu of functions, one of which might be, I need to disappear now, basically. And then it goes back through the previous view controller implements this protocols. And whenever that view controller needs, it throws an arrow at this view controller's protocol and tells it to run functions. Does anyone have any questions on that? Cool. That was all I had prepared today so far. Elvis, is there anything else I should cover right now or no?
I think good. That was all I to see, right?
Okay. I know I kind of went through it a little bit fast. Does anyone want me to go over anything again? Cool. Then, do you have a question yet?
For the the gift of the, on the settings page, what was the slide for that?
This one or
It was, it was before you like. Yeah, so when would we wanna not use the navigation? So, is it, you just have a single?
so this is useful when you just want one view controller to pop up. So a good example of this, there's an app that I've used that was basically like logging people into something where you have your background view being like your who's been checked in so far. And then I'd push a button to scan a QR, right? And then this view controller pops up with a little like camera that will scan a QR, right? And because you only want that one screen, you don't want this chain of stacks. You only need this one view controller. You'll see probably the most common use case is selecting photos. If you want to like have a little feature where you have an image and then you're like, change my profile picture, you can click change my profile picture and a view will pop up from below. It has one thing that you want to do, so it's one view. And yeah, actually with selecting images, they've already implemented that like system by itself, but this is when you'd want to use it.
You're like a single screen app, and then, but like in the top left or something, you needed like an about page.
Mhm.
Would it be best to make that a navigation?
Well, that would be your decision, right? Like if I had a single page app and I have an about page, so you're saying 2 pages, right? If I click the about, do you want it to pop up from below and just kind of overlay it? Or do you want it to go to the left as an entirely new page, which you can press back, right? So that's like your design decision. Yes.
Can, like, doesn't have to be always.
You can theoretically do that, but I would say that in practice, it's not the greatest idea.
Are you saying like if you could like infinitely like push like a view controller, that or that kind of thing? Like, cause you could always like stack a view on top of another view. There's no real limit.
You mean like have a view controller and then that views is a navigation controller, right? Or am I getting the question wrong?
No, instead of like, maybe instead of like, if this swap like.
Yeah. Do you wanna-
The navigation controller, there's only one defined throughout the life cycle of the app. So you only have really like one navigation controller, and every time you reference like navigation controller dot push, like this new controller, it'll be talking about like that root navigation controller. So it's like it's kind of like you have a copy on every like controller that you create after that, but there's only one real there's only one real navigation controller.
Well,
That's gonna be root.
I think you can have multiple.
Multiple.
Yeah. I think it like in practice, that's something you rarely ever want to do. You want to have it the way that he just explained it. You want to have it so that there's only one. Because that's the way that it was like designed and that's the way that we think about it. Yes. But I'm pretty sure that like if you really wanted to, you could. But that's another thing that's like just don't do that. You know? Yes.
So like, when you download like a social media, let's say like, it's the same thing like Spotify.
Right.
But it's not the there's a like free account, make you first sign in. to the
Yes.
account. And once you sign in, you're basically not on that page ever again.
Right.
You signed in.
Yeah.
So would that be, or I guess that'd be the case on like Facebook or Twitter, would that be a navigation? Or
Yeah. So what you're asking about is like the like free view controller stuff, which is I think most of that's handled in the window. So in the textbook, actually, we have like 5 lines of code that we have you copy for your projects, or that we will have you copy at least in future projects, which basically sets up this navigation controller thing. and it binds it to the window, which is your screen. Before that binding of the window to the screen, you can say like, if this user has logged in, instead of like, imagine that there's an arrow pointing at the navigation controller. Instead of going to this navigation controller, point the arrow at the other navigation controller, kind of thing. So
Oh, it's been like two completely different models.
yes, they're like two separate things. And then you're like, I guess, if you think about an entire app as an MVC model, the way that the screen window works is that binds to an MVC, and that chooses which one to bind to. So that's not something we really get into in the course, but yeah, it pretty much is another MVC on top of that with these as your sub MVCs.
Where are you?
So there's this app delegate and scene delegate function, right? And I think it's app delegate. Actually, what do you say? The Windows stuff.
That's in scene delegate. So here in this function scene, this is where you set up your window so that your root view controller is actually a UI navigation controller. On the course textbook, I
Yeah, I think it's
pasted like
close to
some
textbook.
code earlier. Because I was gonna implement it in my last demo, but I ended up not doing it because we don't have enough time. It's in intro to Swift
Is it in?
demo, yeah.
It's probably this one.
I mean, yeah, it's this one. So this is the kind of code, this is the code that you would write in that scene delegate file that Alden just showed you, where you would say like, you would set up all the Windows stuff. So like here, you would set up, yeah, you would set up your window scene to have a root view controller called UI navigation controller. And windows and scenes are kind of like the same. You consider them in this class as the same thing. The only difference is that a window could contain a window. Like the reason there's a difference between window and scene is because on the iPad, you could run the same app twice. But they're both running on the same window. But they're two different scenes. So I guess not to get into that too much. On any iPhone, you can only run one app at a time. So there's only one window at a time at all times. And that window, which is like the screen itself, you have to set its root view controller here. And by setting its root view controller, you could set that root view controller of the window of your screen to be a UI navigation controller. That way, you could push and present as many views as you want to within your app.
So that example of like the sign up, the sign in screen,
That code would happen in these files, like here, for example, or in app delegate 2, depending on how the sign-in stuff works. But that would basically just be like, instead of this navigation controller, we're gonna put a different one that points to the already signed in.
And as you can see, it's clarified even a bit more. Like this VC is called view controller. So I'm making an instance of my view controller, and then I'm setting my like root view controller for my window to be a UI navigation controller with its root view controller being my view controller. So when you implement this code, it's almost as if nothing changed within your app. Like your app will run like exactly the same. It's just that this time your view controller before was just the view controller. Now when you add the navigation view controller, it's all of this. It's basically a new it's a new view controller with its root view controller being another view controller. So there's a lot of like nesting and like fitting stuff into other views that's going on here in these couple lines of code.
Does anyone have any other question? Yes. This code?
Nah. So every time you create like an app, you want to create like an app that goes through multiple screens. This code is not given to you by default. But whenever you want to create an app that can navigate between screens, this is the exact like line for line like code that you're going to be writing. It's literally like window scene. We have a part of in our textbook that talks about this more in depth. But like you're basically just setting up your window scene, creating your view controller, setting the Windows root view controller to be that navigation. This is the most important line, the root view controller being the UI navigation controller. And then the window that make key invisible. I forget exactly what it does, but if you don't have this line, then nothing works. Like your screen won't work. And then you're setting the window of this app, self.window, to be this new window that you created. So you're overriding the window object anyway.
If we like give you starter code for the demos, you won't need to implement this, but this will already be here. We include it in the textbook because it's not given in the actual Xcode projects. And like if you wanted to build your own for fun, you need to copy this in. But again, as Elvis said, you just need to copy it in and know that the most important part is this part here, where we say we're going to wrap our view controller in this navigation controller MVC system, which is the pictures that I drew with the stack. You can just have like an if something something, then instead of this window, we have a different one, right? No, it's not working.
It's for login, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like in this if, we would be checking like the login key and like the login, like you'd be doing a lot of backend stuff here between like 26, between this if statement and this other block of code. And if this is if the log, say like the login is successful, then it'll go to this window. If not, it'll go to the other window.
It gets more complicated if you actually deal with logins because you have to manage the login stuff. So it'll get a little bit more complicated, but this is the general idea. Cool. I think we move on to the